Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is David Lobel. I'm the director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment, and we have this great symposium series, which we call the Global Food Security Symposium, which is supported through the generosity of Zach and Elizabeth Nelson. And today we have the first of the symposia talk for this year, and I know this is on a week that's maybe one of, if not the most busy at Stanford of the whole year, so it's great to see all of you here, and thank you for coming. I'm going to turn it over now to my esteemed colleague, Roz Naylor, who will introduce the speakers and talk about the structure of the talk, and Roz is also the brainchild behind this, so we're all very excited to focus on India today, in particular on water issues. So, Roz.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for coming here today. Just watching the interactions, it seems like old home week, and there are a lot of people that have come back for this talk, including our featured speakers. So anyway, let me introduce them. We today are going to have Junaid Ahmad give the featured speech, and then Avinash Kishore give the respondent speech, and then the three of us will come up here for discussion. And we will run this till about 4:30 or so, and then open it up for general discussion, and then go into a reception for an hour so that everyone can have time to interact with everyone. So let me start with Junaid Ahmad. And Dr. Ahmad, I'm going to call him Junaid because we go back for decades as PhD classmates and close friends. Junaid is the country director for the World Bank program in India. As many of you know, India is the largest program for the World Bank, and by far its most important, given the number of people living in poverty and food insecurity, as well as just the dynamicism of India in South Asia. Junaid joined the World Bank's Delhi office in 2016 and began working in this program after serving for as a chief of staff for the World Bank's president at the time, Jim Young Kim. Maybe we can find out about the new president. I don't know. This will be discussion over a glass of wine. Junaid has been at the World Bank for his entire career. After finishing his PhD, he joined the World Bank's Young Professional Program in 1991 and worked on infrastructure development in Africa and Eastern Europe. He's had numerous positions around the world during his course at the World Bank in diverse regions of Africa, Middle East, North Africa, India, other parts of South Asia. But most importantly, I think for this conference and for this talk today, prior to going to the president's office, Junaid was the senior director for the Water Global Practice program there at the World Bank. And this was really a new feature of the World Bank to try to grapple with the difficult issues of water management and service delivery around the world throughout the developing countries. He really became known for his strong track record in management and leadership and the area of service delivery. So he will make some comments about that as they pertain to India today. Like many World Bank professionals, he's lived in many locations and has spent much time in the field in different parts of the world. He was the deputy resident representative and principal economist in Johannesburg. And I think that period of yours in South Africa really cemented your expertise in the water area and gave you some creds for running this whole program, to say nothing of other challenges in Africa. He also was the team leader for the water and sanitation program in New Delhi. And in 2004, he was one of the authors for the World Bank Development Report on Making Services Work for the Poor, which is his theme today. So I've personally known Junaid since the 1980s, when we were actually classmates here at Stanford at the Food Research Institute, which no longer exists, but we have tried to reestablish this through the Center on Food Security and the Environment. And so we're really lucky to have you back. Junaid grew up as a Bangladeshi national, from Bangladesh. And I think he gets great pride, by the way, of being a Bangladeshi running the India program. Just putting that out there. But after growing up in Bangladesh, he did his BA at Brown University, his MPA at Harvard, and then his PhD here at Stanford. So, we had at least 4 great years at Stanford, and I can say I never would have finished my PhD if Junaid hadn't helped me get through my final defense. So Junaid, welcome back to Stanford. We also have Avinash Kishore here with us, and Avinash is a new colleague of mine and a very special colleague. He works as a research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, also in Delhi. So both are situated in Delhi, despite the air pollution, and have real fine experience there. Avinash came to IFPRI in 2012 after completing his PhD in environmental economics and public policy at Harvard and his MPA at Princeton University. And he also spent, prior to those graduate years, working for the International Water Management Institute for 4 years. So he's also got great experience in water resource management, but also in agriculture. And I would say that Avinash, trained in agriculture and development economics, goes way beyond the microeconomics, which most of us are trained in, and is also really an expert in macroeconomics. And I think the insights that he brings to issues like trade policy and how India's trade policy affects not only Indian farmers, but farmers and communities throughout South Asia and other parts of the developing world are really insightful. So we'll get to those issues as well. So thank you both for bringing real field-based experience to our discussion today. Avinash, welcome to Stanford, and I'll turn it over to Junaid. Thank you.
I think it's wonderful for Samia, my wife, and myself to be back here. We were here in the 90s. Our daughter was born at Stanford. She got married yesterday, day before yesterday. So coming back to Stanford is quite emotional. Introducing India is a complex matter. There is never one presentation that will do justice to India. So what I've chosen today is to use the theme of water to talk about India. But you could easily take away the word water and add health, education, urban, and the same themes will emerge. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit around some stories on water to bring out the complex political economy of service delivery in India. And it's complex. It's not easy to absorb. It's not easy to understand. But let's see if I can share some of the complexity with you. Now, one thing I have to tell you, it's interesting. I spent quite a bit of my life working on water, but I have no expertise in water. Never studied water. Really don't understand water that much. So what I did was really look at water from the perspective of the political economy of service delivery, from the context of the political economy of institutions, from the concept of economics of service delivery. So everything that has nothing to do with water per se, but everything to do with water. So it's really one of these, how shall I say, one of these beautiful gifts that I got from Stanford, from the Food Research Institute, is how to connect. Food Research Institute was an institute that really tried to promote an understanding of across disciplines. And my love affair with water comes not from water, but from this ability that Food Research Institute shared with me on how to make connections across borders. And that's what I'm going to share with you. So, what is this water crisis in India? Well, first let me tell you how I discovered it. I was in Delhi in the year 2000. I'd just gone there in charge of the regional water program. I'd moved from South Africa, and a very good friend and colleague of mine, the city manager of Johannesburg, came to visit. As we were driving from the airport, he noticed something quite interesting. He noticed these structures on top of houses, buildings, storage tanks. And he says, "What are these?" I said, "They're storage tanks. That's how water is stored." He says, "What do you mean that's how water is stored?" I said, "That's how water is stored. You see, you don't get full service of water in New Delhi. In fact, in any of the cities of India, you get 5, 6, 7 hours of water. So to mimic 24/7, people store water in the tanks, and then you get 24/7 water." And he looked at me and says, "What are you talking about? This is India." I said, "Yes." He says, "How can they live off of intermittent water?" And it was very interesting. For me, intermittent water was in my culture. Growing up in Bangladesh, intermittent water was the way we lived. So early morning, water would arrive in the pipes, and I would remember my father calling someone, the person who worked for us, to open the pump so that the water could be stored in the water tank upstairs, right? So it was part of a natural story that we had intermittent water and you store it in a tank. That's the way world works. Many, many years later, when I would go back from schooling in the US to Bangladesh, something had changed. We still had intermittent water. My father had actually now a remote control to turn the pump on, but it was still intermittent water, right? So when Ketso Gordon, the city manager, aghast at what he saw, turned around and asked me how this could be, we then began to do some research. And so the one picture that changed my whole approach to water was this. Now, if you take a look at this picture, and you have all these cities in India, and you look at Delhi, for example, Delhi gets 223 liter per capita per day of water, but it only delivers 4 hours of water a day, right? Chandigarh gets 332 liters per capita per day, but it delivers water only 10 hours. In fact, there is no relationship between the amount of water that goes into a city and the number of hours of water that the city agency delivers to households. So basically, India lives off of intermittent supply. Now, what's wrong with intermittent supply? By the way, just as a trademark, Paris, I spent several years there, 150 liters of water per capita per day, and they deliver 24 hours of water. No storage tanks, right? So what's wrong with intermittent water? First, what happens with intermittent water is early in the morning is full pressure water coming from the tanks, main sources. It arrives at your house, and then water pressure falls because there's no longer full pressure water. When water pressure falls in these pipes all have little holes, right? So when the pressure falls, the barrier that full pressure water holds disappears. So everything that's around the pipes begin to creep into the pipes. And next morning, when full pressure comes, everything that's crept in gets stuck into your tank because it basically washes all the gunk into your tank. Now, this is one reason why intermittent supply has the worst health effects, right? Number one. Number two, intermittent supply acts like a water hammer, right? Pressure goes up, pressure falls, pressure goes up, pressure falls. And when that happens, what happens is pipes break, right? So cost to running intermittent. So when I began to learn about this, I asked one of the chief engineers of Delhi Water Agency, why is it that you have intermittent supply? Why can't you make this a continuous supply of water like anywhere else? You turn the tap on, there is water that's coming because it's full pressure water. And this gentleman, is an elderly gentleman, looked at me and said, son, you realize what intermittent water does. So I gave him my intellectual arguments of what it does. He says, you don't understand. He says, you see, when it acts like a water hammer and the pipes break, it means I can give out more contracts. Right? You can give out more contracts. Yep. And I can make margins on that. It's unbelievable, right? Here we are thinking about water and intermittent supply and so on. I was getting a lesson about the political economy of running a service, right? How do I make money off of running a service? I let pipes break. Right? But ultimately, why is it that you get this intermittent supply? Very simply, that the water agency is run by the chief minister of a state, who is the policymaker, the provider, and the regulator. Judge and jury are the same, right? And the policymaker, provider, and regulator means that the chief minister actually can employ people. So, for example, I go to the chief minister for whom I voted and said, I want a job in the water company, has the full power to give me the job, right? So all of these utilities are excessive employment baskets. So there's no one regulating your work. There's no policymaker that's saying this is how water should be managed. So this incredible story of service provider, regulator, and policymaker being one and the same creates the type of incentives that no one really cares about whether water gets delivered or not. Right? And within the utility, you get even more perverse relations, that you have people who say, well, intermittent water can break the pipes, I can give more contracts. But it doesn't end there. When you have intermittent supply, often what cities will do is they'll run their water supply with water tankers, right? You call the water tanker shows up. Well, guess who owns the water tankers? The very people who run the city water supply, right? So why would they be interested in giving you continuous water supply when they can run their water tankers given the intermittent supply? So you can see this judge and jury story is deep in its implication. So this is where I go back to say, this has nothing to do with water. It's got everything to do with the political economy of how service delivery happens. And if you look at education, you look at health, you look at electricity, the same problem emerges every time. Right? So the problem of delivery of water in cities in India is how do you create the separation of powers? That's the big challenge, and I'll come back to it. You look at some of these cities, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Vizag, these are big cities. Over the years, the number of hours has been steadily declining, right? It's embedded. The gains from intermittent supply, the too many people who win at the end of the day, and the gains they get from an intermittent supply just makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you look in terms of comparisons around the world, in developed countries, the average of 123 utilities, they're delivering 24 hours water. If you look at developing countries, top 25% of the utilities, they're delivering 24 hours per day. Average in India, 5.6. Right? But again, this is not a technical problem. No one is going to accuse Indians of not having engineering capability or IT capability, right? This is pure political economy. Now, to look at it from another perspective. If you're connected to a utility and water arrives, you are paying about 50 rupees per 500 liters of water. And if you're not connected to the utility and you're going for private connections, you pay 4 times more. Or if you rely on a private water tanker, you're paying 30 times more. And if it's a private stand post, 70 times more. Well, guess who pays for water from private water tanker, private connection, or private stands? It's the poor people. Who is the one that's getting the benefit of an underpriced water? It's the middle class and above. So when you go and talk to politicians, they say, no, we cannot price water because the poor will suffer. No, they're saying we cannot price water because the middle class constituency that votes me in is not going to be happy. This is the irony of the whole story. So here you have a water utility in the urban sector, judge and jury not functioning the way it should, pricing of water barely zero. You have basically complete abuse in terms of consumption of water and its inequities in terms of distribution. Right? It's the poor that fundamentally suffer. So, what is it that one begins to do in terms of changing this set of situation, right? Well, this is hardcore politics, right? Why hardcore politics? It's telling the chief minister you can no longer be the chairperson of the water utility. You either be a policymaker or you give up your position as chief minister and become the CEO of the water company. Right, number one. Number two, create an arm's length from the state and the company itself, right? Let the water company be run as a commercial entity. Don't run it as a department of government. Right? Very tough, because those who are employed inside government departments don't like to be part of a commercial company. It challenges their employment status. Third, and this is the biggest story, you have to price water. And that's where the politics becomes extremely difficult. I often say that the most expensive water for poor people is free water. Because whenever you're delivering free water, it's the middle class that gets the water, not the poor. So converting the politics of a country to actually charge for water, to make markets deliver water, is probably one of the biggest political economy stories that exists, right? So this is the first part of the story of India's water crisis. Urban water utilities, delivering intermittent water, not priced, and very much inefficient in its delivery, inequitable in its delivery. Second story, groundwater exploitation. India is the largest groundwater abstractor globally, and what's happening is you're beginning to see quite a bit of groundwater depletion. I know in California you've had situations of what do they call it, subsidence happening, where groundwater extraction and you have collapse of neighborhoods. It's happening in India, it's happening in Indonesia, right? Because groundwater management is a classic commons good issue. In India, groundwater abstraction has other dimensions, right? The dimensions are what we call the agriculture, electricity, water nexus. So I'll give you an example of the city of the state of Punjab. Punjab decided a long time ago that it would be the producer of rice and wheat. But to produce rice and wheat, what it does is it gives free electricity to its farmers. And once you have free electricity, what you can do is you can tap into the groundwater and guzzle away as much as you want. Well, first, rice and wheat are water guzzling crops. Two, free electricity into pumping. It's a recipe for groundwater depletion. And that's what's beginning to happen in Punjab. The Chief Minister of Punjab said something very interesting a couple of months ago. He said, Punjab can no longer be an exporter of water. because that's basically what it is. It's exporter of water by producing rice and wheat. It should not be producing rice and wheat. Now, how would you fix it? Well, you could charge for water, you could charge for electricity, and you could see behavior change. You could change the food policy pricing so that perhaps more diversified cropping could come in. But all of that is very difficult to achieve. You have a farmers group, which is very powerful, which is getting free electricity. To get them to give up the access to free electricity is one of the biggest challenges that you face. So what do? Well, you begin to be very creative. So what is Punjab doing? What is Punjab doing is very simple. It's turning around and telling its farmers that I will pay you if you reduce your consumption of electricity. First, electricity is free. Now you're going to pay them if they reduce the amount of electricity used. That's the shall I use the popular terms these days, quid pro quo, that is happening in Punjab, right? So you're beginning to see now, very interestingly, farmers in Punjab becoming more efficient in electricity use, getting rewarded for it, and hence reducing their water guzzling habits from groundwater. A very roundabout way of preserving groundwater. But that's the political economy. Now, when I was last in Punjab, I met many of the farmers group, and I asked them whether they were aware of the impact of groundwater depletion of their farming behavior. Of course they are, right? One of the things that I have learned is probably one of the most intelligent, savvy, politically aware groups are farmers, right? It's, of course we are. But they said, give us an alternative which is risk-free, right? If you give us an alternative, we'll switch. How do you give an alternative? How do you get a whole state to shift from rice and wheat on subsidized electricity to horticulture, fruits, vegetables, right? Not easy. So what we're doing in the World Bank is we're trying something which may work. We've turned to some of the big agribusinesses, Nestle, Cargill, and the others, and saying, would you be willing to purchase from Punjab crop XYZ at market value? And they're saying, absolutely, we are. If so, can we then make the contract between farmers and Cargill or Nestle to actually lift that kind of production? If you can, then you'll be able to get farmers to move. Right? But you have to do this in a big way, in a massive way, so they aren't held at risk for gradual shift in their behavior of water use. But this is a big problem, this connection between electricity, water, and agriculture. By the way, just as water agencies or water utilities are intermittent, what you find is electricity utilities in India, the distribution of electricity, almost all of them are bankrupt. Okay? And why are they bankrupt? Precisely because of this kind of pricing. And as they're bankrupt, how do they get financed? They get financed because they go and borrow from public sector banking. In India, 70% of the banking is public sector. So look at the connection. Poor agricultural practices having an impact on electricity utilities, and eventually having an impact on the financial system of India. Today, the non-performing assets of banking systems in India is about 12%. That's huge. The banking system in India is facing serious crisis. Today, you have a recession or a downturn, economic downturn in India, related partly to the fact that the financial markets are not working, the banking sector is not working. But to undo this is not just simply fixing the banking system, you have to be able to politically manage the linkage all the way from farmers up to the banking system. That's the connections that begin to happen when you have a distortion in one place or the other. Here you can see that surface irrigated irrigation has gone down and groundwater irrigation has gone up. This is a serious issue. This is simply to show that charges for residential users are about a tenth of likely full economic costs. So water pricing is almost nil in India. It's ironic that today we talk about putting a price on carbon, but we're not willing to put a price on water. And the irony is that putting a price on water will affect poor people, when in fact the way the system is delivering, it is affecting the poor people. So first, the water utilities. Second, the groundwater. The third is storage capacity. In a world of climate change, the uncertainties of climate are huge. You have to store water, right? And if you look at different countries, look at USA, that's a lot of cubic meters of water per capita that's stored, dams, right? You look at India, that's pretty low. Now, doing dams in today's world is a pretty tough job, right? You will have all sorts of effects in the system, environmental, social, economic, and there are a lot of lobby groups around the world that are very resistant to building dams. And for the right reasons. Dams have been built in the past without taking into account social impact, environmental impact. Dams have left a lot of people without livelihood. Dams have displaced people, no issue. But in a world of climate change, you need storage of water. How do you bridge that? Well, part of it is you have an alternate storage. It's called groundwater. We just heard what's happening with groundwater. That the biggest storage capacity is underground. And yet all the economics all the policy framework that is put on the table is depleting that. And very hard to do dams in normal conditions, very hard. We in the World Bank, if we're supporting dams, the filters that we have to go through, you might as well not do them. It's extremely hard. Right. By the way, I have to tell you, it's very, very interesting. If you go to Sweden, which drew most of its energy out of hydro, so you have dams that store water and then you have hydro, you go there and they will tell you, don't do dams, don't do hydro. Not the fact that they build their economy on hydro is one thing, but they're telling the rest of the world, including countries like India, don't build dams. So the storage issue is a very, very challenging issue for India. I want to talk about one more aspect of the water crisis, pollution. Rivers in India are highly polluted. And the pollution comes from two sources. One, the urban system, so all these towns, about 20% of waste is treated. Rest go right into the river. Second is agriculture itself, producing all sorts of side effects, all polluting the rivers. And third is that the rivers are losing their power of flow. The abstraction of water from rivers has been excessive, that the flow of water is falling. So if the flow falls, obviously if you're polluting the rivers, you can't keep it clean. So how do you deal with polluted rivers? Well, first, you have to get cities to actually start building wastewater treatment. But you have the same problem that you have with water utilities. Building a wastewater treatment is not a problem. Technically, it's easy to do. Running it is hard. Why? Because you have to charge for it, you have to maintain it, right? Charging and maintaining it when judge and jury for all service providers is dubious, wastewater treatment plants suddenly get built, gold-plated, but don't function, and so you get complete waste into the rivers. That's the one major issue. Second is agriculture, but agricultural production, and I hope Avinash will talk a little bit about it, has to change in India completely. But the third is very interesting, is this whole issue of river flow, environmental flow of rivers. So I went to China, and when I was in charge of the water program of the bank, very interesting conversation with the Chinese. The Chinese began to say, we're having problems with water flow. So why? Because upper riparian states are abstracting too much water, and lower riparian are not getting enough water. We've got to figure out a way to balance this. So I said, what do you think? They said, we want to create water markets. This is China, right? I said, what do you mean you want to create water markets? What we want to do is we want to incentivize the upper riparians to be more efficient in their use of water, and for every cubic meter that they save, we'll pay them. That means more water remains in the river. If not, even more water is released into the river. And over time, we want to get the lower riparian states to begin to pay the upper riparian states for greater access to water. This is China, right? This is what we're trying to discuss in India, whether along the Ganges, whether you can create this kind of a water market to get water flows back in the system. This is going to be a challenge, but there is no other way. See, in India, I think one of the challenges is India has gone from being a planned economy to becoming a regulated economy and not really investing in becoming a market economy. Markets are probably the most mysterious concept that policymakers face. It's the most distrusted concept, that markets are against the consumer, that markets are against the poor. Very rarely do we analyze government failure in terms of affecting the poor. But markets, everyone is almost convinced don't work. And yet it is in the market that lies the solution of many of these issues. The other area that India today is facing, and you may know about this, is air pollution. Right? So Delhi is facing quite a bit of air pollution story. Why? Because you have basically crop burning from surrounding states, you have vehicles that are not using the right fuel, not energy efficient, you have industries. There's a whole group of reasons why you have air pollution in India. It's severe enough that you now can link mortality to the air pollution in a severe way. Very simply, very hard for us in the New Delhi office to attract international staff to move to Delhi because of air pollution. Well, what we're trying to do is create a concept of airshed management. Just as you have watershed, the idea is, can you begin to look at airshed? And if you look at airshed, can you create a governance around airshed management? That all the stakeholders who influence a certain airshed, can they be brought around in a governance structure where give and take in terms of building a consensus of how to deal with air pollution. It's the same thing as with watershed management. So ultimately, if I were to define the water crisis of India, it is a political economy crisis of institutions. Unless India begins to truly create a separation of powers between who's the policymaker, who's the regulator, and who's the provider, it will continue to face these problems that I'm talking about. For me, the future of India lies in the states of India. That if India can exercise its federalism so that you allow a Maharashtra to compete against a Tamil Nadu, to compete against a Bihar, that you allow each of these states, some the size of countries, UP is 220 million people, West Bengal is 100 million people, that you allow the natural resource endowment of these states to drive the economics of those states, that kind of federalism may well create the competition towards better service delivery. So ultimately, for me, what matters is the structure of government and the governance of government. What Prime Minister Modi correctly has said, minimum government, maximum governance. How does one achieve that? Because if one doesn't achieve that, the problems that I'm talking about in terms of intermittent water supply, groundwater depletion, water pollution, lack of water storage capacity will be the driving force of the water sector in India. But it will not only be restricted to that, it will begin to infiltrate, as it is already done, into other sectors of the economy, and may in fact bring India's growth rate down from what it aspires to, which is a 7% plus growth rate from where it is today. Quite a challenge, but it's at the end of the day a political economy of service delivery. Thank you.
I think he's put some pretty major challenges on the table here. Avinash, we'd love your perspective on this issue and related issues to food and water.
Thank you, Rose. Would you let me know when I'm close to time? Because Junaid covered a number of issues that I also have opinions on, and I don't want to.
I'll just hold after 15 minutes, I'll hold my hand up.
So first thing is, I just want to submit a clarification that I'm not an expert on macroeconomics. That said, everyone in India is expert on cricket, politics, and macroeconomics. That's how you got demonetization, right? So I'm not on that. I also am not a student of urban water issues. I am a beneficiary or a victim, whichever way you want to look at it. I get a lot of water for very cheap. I barely pay anything. But yeah, I would not comment on it. Just one thing that your friend and you saw only overhead tanks. In Delhi, we have underground tanks where we store water and then we pump up on over. So a lot of fixed, lot of capital investment goes on it. The third thing is that Junaid already presented a complex picture. I am not going to offer any solutions. Actually, whatever the few papers that I have written in my research career, I have never written a paper that said something worked. All my papers talk about how something doesn't work. I'm not a pessimistic guy, but that's how it has happened. So I will only add to the complications on the irrigation and energy part that Junaid talked about. He talked about the energy irrigation nexus in India. There's a third element to it too, which is the food. So it's food, energy, and water nexus. Punjab and Haryana, you use a lot of water because you have free electricity, but you also use a lot of water because you are incentivized to produce rice. Or for example, in Maharashtra, you have, or Western UP, Uttar Pradesh, you have subsidies to keep producing sugarcane. So what we do with food policy, also independently of energy and water policy, or maybe together with it, makes things more difficult, makes things more unsustainable. On the institutional solution that Junaid was talking about, where you have an independent, excuse me, where you have an independent regulatory body to bring some discipline. My sense, my reading from understanding and following the power regulation in India is where, on World Bank's advice in early 90s, we did set up regulatory bodies that were supposedly independent. But if you look at their performance, these regulatory bodies are independent. Navroz Dubash has studied it carefully at Center for Policy Research. They are independent only in the name. So it's the same IAS or the chief engineer who retires from the electricity utility, goes on to become the electricity regulatory authority or the members of the regulatory authority, and never takes any step that really forces the utility to do the right thing. And I will give you one example from the energy sector, is where no one knows in India. I claimed earlier in our conversation with you, Ross, that 20 to 25% of all electricity sold in India is sold for groundwater pumping. We don't know, actually. That's a made-up number because pumps, there are 22 million of those, of which around 13, 14 million are electrified, do not have meter connections. And when the regulatory authorities first came, they needed to know how much electricity was sold to pump sets. And in 20, 25 years, almost a generation has passed, none of the utilities have really done a good job of metering pumps. Let's say there you have resistance from farmers. So electricity regulatory body said, okay, let's meter the 11 kVA feeders, because from there you can have some sense of how much electricity is going to farmers, or at least let's meter a random sample of these feeders so that we can do some estimation. And utilities, they keep making excuses year after year. Why? Because right now what happens is all the accounted for energy sales is there, and then the rest is two sources of loss, right? Energy that is sold to farmers and the transmission and distribution losses. If you do not account for how much you are selling to farmers, then you can appear to be more efficient than you are, because the regulatory body sets you a target that you have to cut down on T&D losses, as we call them. In India, we love abbreviations. So transmission and distribution losses can be as high as 30, 35% in India. So what utilities do is they show overconsumption in agriculture and show that they are doing a good job of cutting down transmission and distribution losses, right? It does two things. One is it shows them to be more efficient than they actually are. And two is they get every unit that they show that they're selling to farmers, the state is supposed to give them subsidy on it. So it gives them more money from the state, from the taxpayer. So the subsidy that is supposed to be in the name of farmers, whether right or wrong, is actually going to other uses or to finance inefficiencies of the utilities. And 20, 25 years, this basic task, which should have been achieved, has not been achieved. And I do not know of any electricity engineer or utility company that has been seriously penalized for it. It's just backslapping. So even when you create institutions, regulatory capture in India across sectors is quite common. So you can order, or by fiat, you can create regulatory authorities, but to really make them work in the ways that a regulatory authority should work, where it's transparent, where all the procedures are followed, is a whole different matter. It's the same in controlling pollution too. A lot of power plants, some sitting in the heart of Delhi city, violate emission norms. And blatantly, it's known, but they do not get punished for various reasons. One of the reasons is India still is, till recently was a power scarce country, so we couldn't afford to shut down a power plant, though now we do that in Delhi during the periods of peak pollution. But the other was that the guy who is now regulator was in that role a few years ago, and the guys who are reporting to him or whom he's supposed to hold accountable are his friends, his juniors, his mentees, all of that. So creating regulatory body is one thing, but really enforcing regulation is a whole different ballgame. And yeah, I don't know how we'll achieve that or how we'll do that. This is again one of the things that where maybe some regulatory bodies are doing better than others, and some states' regulatory authorities are doing better than others. And if we document them and we had more exchange, maybe some improvements will happen. But I'm not sure. A third thing that, again, I'm responding to Junaid here too is on the markets issues. That yes, it's true, especially in agriculture and natural resources. India had some sort of liberalization in 1991, but that liberalization bypassed the ag and the food sector. Our wholesale marketing norms, land leasing norms, agroforestry norms, all of them are still from around the 60s, 70s phase. I think part of the reason is that no one in India, not Manmohan Singh, not Bajpayee, and not even our current Prime Minister, has done a good job of selling liberalization or selling markets to the liberalization. Brought a lot of benefits. I am from the generation that benefited enormously from liberalization, and even the poorest benefited, counter to some of the arguments actually. It did it reduced poverty, etc., but it has never been politically popular. And even our current Prime Minister, who is immensely popular, I don't think has done a great job of selling liberalization. If you look at it, he did talk about minimum government, maximum governance, but if only Prime Minister did the things they say. So that's something that has been a larger political failure. I am not a political scientist, but it seems to be a fact that is staring us in the face. The other thing that there's some problems in India, I think, that are pure logistical problems. So unlike urban water supply, volumetric pricing of water, which is what you would require, there are two things why, apart from just the fact that markets and market-led development may not be enormously popular, I think there are two barriers. One is the size. So if you look at groundwater, let's say if you want to do volumetric, think of like one of us become the groundwater czar of India, and your job is, or UP for that matter. So in India, there are 22 to 23 million mechanized wells. Each irrigates just 2 to 3 hectare land, and if you just value the water selling business, it's less than $1,000 per year economy. So regulating, volumetrically pricing, measuring how much water you are pumping, how much water you are irrigating, and how you're using 23 million of these tiny users is almost like measuring tailpipe emissions. You know, even when we are talking about carbon pricing, no one talks about measuring and tracking tailpipe emissions. Measuring 23 million people who are scattered over a vast countryside, and each is very small. The total value that it is generating is probably smaller, would be a big fraction of the amount, the cost that it would take to collect the data, logistical, financial, technological, would be a very, very high share of the value that this unit produces. So unless some sort of form of aggregation happens, and by aggregation, I don't mean Sovietization, whether it be producer companies, cooperatives, I don't know what the form that it would take. I think it would be very hard. I think it's practically impossible. We may talk all about it as we want, but I think volumetric pricing of water in rural areas and having water markets based on it is going to be extremely challenging. If you look at examples of countries where it is done, let's say Australia, which is known for its Murray-Darling reforms and volumetric pricing, even there, you have an exemption if you're a farmer less than 2 hectare land. If you use the same thumb rule in India, 95% of farmers and pump owners would be exempt. So this challenge is enormous. Tied to it is the political challenge, because any reforms initially has hiccups. And here you have, let's say, 23 million wells, 22 to 23 million wells, each supporting 3 to 5 farming families. So you're talking about something like 60, 70 million families who have, even if 2 voters each, 140 million voters are the ones that you're going to irritate right away, right? That has been extremely difficult, and that's why the kind of creative solutions that Junaid was talking about, where in Punjab, instead of charging farmers for electricity, we are trying to create opportunity cost by bribing them, in a sense. We are trying to do the same thing with solar pumps, where solar pumps, right now, the only way we control the volume or the amount of water that gets pumped, only indirect and poor control that we have is through electricity supply, it's rationing, limiting new connections. If tomorrow, like cell phones and laptops, solar panels also became really cheap, then that connection would also break, right? And then that would be a disaster. It won't be a disaster in areas where water tables are already 200, 300 meters deep, but it will be a disaster in areas like Punjab where water table is low but depleting, because it will accelerate the process, because then you would not need a whole lot of panels, right? So the only thing that I can think of is like if you did net metering, right? But there too, the challenge remains the same, the twofold. One is 23 million net metering guys whose production patterns, distribution patterns, when will they offload the electricity to the grid is something that we don't know. And it will take a whole different order of operations management challenge to work that out. A second problem is that our utility companies look at farmers as their headaches. They don't look at farmers as their consumers or clients, for a good reason, because the farmers are their loss leaders, right? So they have not invested in understanding farmers' water use behavior. They have imposed certain water use behavior on farmers, but have barely invested in understanding the seasonality and all the details of how farmers use it, power and through power water. Unless they invest in that, the net metering, we have a large project in India which encourages net metering. And I think if net metering happens, it can change the nature of this nexus. Farmers will become net generator of energy, and it would be good and water overexploitation may come down because there'll be an opportunity cost. But implementing it, I think right now we lack in the state capacity, and we need to have a massive investment in our electricity utility companies where they understand the operational challenge of managing this. We'll need collectivization there too, because if we have each pump independently offloads power, then metering them, tracking them would be another problem. So we may need like solar cooperatives or solar collectives or companies or whatever, where a bunch of farmers come together to offload that. But that brings me to the maybe the penultimate point that I want to make, which is another scarcity, and especially for researchers in India that we are facing, is that whether we are doing the China model of paying the upper riparians from the lower riparians paying them, or any of these management strategies require high quality data. And there, India is falling behind. So at the time, like in 50s, 60s, India was one of the leaders among developing countries on having different sorts of data. We had National Sample Survey, we had greater capacity. British had left behind an institutional legacy where land revenue data, et cetera, were very high quality. Now, whatever sector that you want to work in India, lack of data has become a big problem. If you do not know, for example, Bangladesh is the lower riparian in Ganges Basin, right? And on surface water, we have meters and monitors, et cetera, and we exchange data, et cetera, we do that. But you know, those of you who work in hydrology, that groundwater aquifers and surface water are linked. If you overpump groundwater from your aquifers, then the basal flow in the river goes down, right? That one is not measured. So Bangladesh and India do complain to each other, but there is very little data that it is based on, because no one actually knows how much water, what's the volume, 230 meter cube that Junaid said is a very rough guess estimate, right? So this is just for water. But even for power, like I said, we do not have data. We do not have high frequency, high quality data. We do not have data on consumption. We know that farmers in Punjab or many other parts of India are overusing water, but by how much? What's the, like, every sector after sector, whether it's social, economic, or ecological, environmental, we have a lot of data dashboards in India. Every department now has a data dashboard, but we don't have a lot of data. And the data that is there is of poor quality. I work on a lot of food consumption and other patterns, because that matters as to what would happen to water use, et cetera. In last 9 years, we haven't had any consumption survey. So frankly, I don't know what Indians eat. I know what I eat, but what's the average consumption expenditure? We have had large policy experiments that have happened where we sell rice and wheat for 2 to 3 rupees. We don't know what that has done to food plate, how it is changing incentives of farmers. So lack of data quality is something any sophisticated management would require credible data that's not only in government control, but all the stakeholders also can see the data. One of the reasons this bribing farmers or incentivizing farmers to save power will not work on a large scale, because government lacks credibility. So just like a reserve bank cannot have inflation control, cannot be effective in inflation control if the market doesn't trust that the reserve bank will actually act to bring down inflation whenever it goes up. The farmers, even in Punjab, where World Bank is sponsoring this very interesting experiment where you are paying farmers to reduce their energy use, it is not going to spread like a wildfire, as it should, right? Because farmers have nothing to lose, because farmers, if you talk to them, they think that this is just a backdoor entry. Government wants to meter my power use and will eventually bring in full cost electricity. So it won't be revenue neutral as the government is promising to be. So this lack of credibility that farmers don't trust government for good reasons, actually. So this lack of credibility is the last point that I want to make. The state needs to have credibility with its stakeholders, particularly farmers. It's more needed today than, let's say, even 15, 20 years ago, because if you look at the terms of trade of agriculture, it has gone down sharply over the last 10, 15 years. So agriculture sector vis-a-vis other sectors in India is doing worse. So the inequality between farmers and the rest of the economy is widening very rapidly. The last, very last point that I want to make, especially on groundwater aquifer thing, it's true that farmers understand that the water table is going down. But if you really watch their behavior over a generation, you'll see that some of this overexploitation is strategic. It's a shared resource. I, as a farmer, want to exploit it to the hilt, build my surpluses, invest those surpluses into occupational diversification for my kids. It may sound like a very far-fetched story, but it's actually happening. In Gujarat, there's a postdoc here, Meha Jain, Meha, I, and my colleague Ram Fishman. We saw that in process. And there are others, social scientists who have documented that. The farmers pretty much know, because in many areas, especially in alluvial aquifer, the water decline is slow. You experience it year after year after year. So farmers are making generational adaptations where they're capturing the surplus and then sending their kids to study English, sending them to set up businesses, etc. The problem is, otherwise it would be fine, it's okay. But the problem with this strategy is it's not available to everyone. So in the same village, when you go and interact with Dalit farmers, once the resource is overused, exploited, is like worn down, then they are left to pick up the tab, in the sense that they do not have the capital or the fixed cost that you need to migrate or to diversify, plus other discriminations in India. It's not easy. Their mobility is not that high. So it's not that farmers are naive or it's just a failure of collective action. There's a little bit of a strategic overexploitation of resources going on in many, many parts of India, especially in the alluvial aquifers. In the hard rock aquifers, it's different, because you can run out of water in just like a year, right? Because you're drawing from cracks. So it's less of a collective action and a large pool drawing from the same resource. But in alluvial aquifers of North India, Northwest India, you see this strategic overexploitation. Sorry, I keep saying last thing and then keep adding it. So states learning from states. So in India, the one reason why India is such an interesting place to work and to be in spite of all these interesting or alarming developments, is there are a lot of things going on anytime you go out in any sector or subsector that you are interested in. And a number of new good developments are happening when you persuade one chief minister to try something new, like World Bank persuaded Punjab to try this electricity backhanded way of creating an opportunity cost of electricity. So that's one. But normally, when it comes to energy and water sector, states it has more been the race to the bottom. So state after state after state is following the example of going with the Punjab started with free electricity. Now Telangana does it. Now Tamil Nadu does it. Haryana has almost similar policies. And my home state, Bihar, which is latest to electrify, we are just now electrifying our pump sets. It could have learned from West Bengal. And West Bengal is the only state in India where there is a significant electricity supply to farmers is metered, and it's costed around 3 rupees, 4 rupees per unit. And it's time of day metering. In the evenings, it's even 7 rupees. So Government of Bihar, in their policy document, it says that we looked at West Bengal and we looked at Uttar Pradesh. One is to the east of Bihar and one is to the west, and then decided the policy. And what did they do? I think it's not a weighted average of the two policies. It's basically UP policy, which is 95 paisa, less than 5 cents, less than 1 cent for each unit of electricity, but also with the option of a flat rate electricity, which essentially means zero marginal cost. So learning from each other, which direction it will go is hard to predict. It can be in the right direction. In the same government may follow some market-led, less distortionary policy in one part of the agriculture policy, like direct benefit transfer of subsidies that is happening state after state is doing. But on the other hand, in let's say water or energy, it may follow a completely opposite policy. So this sort of policy schizophrenia is quite common at the federal level and even at the state level. And frankly, I don't know how to have a coherence or how to push or nudge or persuade state governments to have a more coherent policy. If you're doing more market-led in one subsector within the same food agriculture sector, why not do it in the other? And it's an interesting question, why the same state will have free electricity, but will also have direct benefit cash transfer of energy subsidy, seed subsidy, or other subsidies. Thank you. Thanks a lot for bearing with me.
So we should go. Thank you, Avinash. Yeah, have a seat at the end and Junaid in the middle.
You want to sit here?
Okay, that a lot of information that we just got. It was really interesting. And I was going to start with questions, but since we have maybe 25 minutes, let me open it up to the audience, because there's so many interesting things to talk about and a lot of Indian experts here. So when I call on you, say your name and your affiliation too, just so we can get a sense. Okay, please. And there's a mic coming behind you.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm an undergraduate student here. I'm from India, and I've experienced many of these, seen many of these water issues and such firsthand. So my question is actually addressed to both of the speakers today, and I think what both of you touched on is that as well as like institutional failure, there's the market distortion plays a big part in the failure of or the service delivery of water and energy. So I was wondering if you could maybe articulate on some of the more successful models of how the market distortion can be reduced without elimination of kind of the goal of the subsidy of a successfully operating market which still allows the poor to benefit from reduced prices of water and electricity without these large-scale costs of groundwater depletion and so and so.
Junaid, would you like to?
Do you want to take a couple of questions together?
Sure. Let's take one more question, and then on this side, there's a mic coming.
Hi, I'm Suhani. I'm a PhD student here in health policy and economics. I'm interested in understanding, the graph that you had shown about how India is just an anomaly when you compare this to the rest of the world in terms of just for some reason here the politics seem to be more at play than in other countries. And I'm interested in understanding why you think other countries that have similar political problems and like similar incentive structures as well to behave similarly, why is it that India, maybe historically, has just turned out differently?
Let's take one more. Can you guys handle one more? Okay, here we go in the middle.
Thank you. I'm actually a public citizen here. I don't go to Stanford. My question is just, I'm a nutritionist by training, and I'm coming into this with no knowledge of water, theoretically or otherwise. The question is, what should our goal be? You've articulated the problem, and coming in from the measurement domain of evaluations, we always set a goal for ourselves and say, this is where we want to be. I haven't heard a goal that we are trying to achieve either in the short term or the long term, and we've articulated a problem. So for us to make a plan to move forward and resolve this crisis, what are the steps that we need to take besides just saying, hey, this is where we want to be in 5 years? Is there such an idea that's floating around in any state or the country as a whole? Thank you.
Excellent. So what we have on the table here for you two is examples of where markets might have worked without causing massive distortions. The reasons really why India's problems are so much more daunting at one level than other countries at the similar levels of development regarding these issues. And then what is the goal? What are we aiming for? So I'll let you, either one can start.
So how to reduce market distortions? I do not have a ready example from water energy, at least from India. You're seeing it, like I was mentioning towards the end of my talk, they're seeing it in other sectors where earlier a lot of subsidies that went to farmers were price subsidies that distorted market. So if you're getting subsidized seed, the seed will be sold at a lower price and government will control price. It's still persisting for energy and fertilizer. And increasingly with government having a better handle of who the farmers are and where they are, you're seeing that there's a movement towards direct cash transfer. So you buy the seed at market price, government is not regulating the prices, and the difference is transferred to your bank account. So there are these examples that are coming up, they're building up. One hopes that the largest subsidies in India are food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, food and fertilizer, at least in this case, and energy subsidy would be there too. In these three, you haven't seen that kind of movement. It's partly because the government hasn't figured out the logistics yet. In food especially, we spend more money on food subsidy than government of India at least, than our health and education expenditure combined. And its food subsidy is mainly rice and wheat. You could think that instead of giving rice and wheat at 2 rupees and 3 rupees a kilo, we could give a cash transfer and let families decide what do they want to buy, and that way they'll have more diverse diet and better nutritional outcomes. Somehow, whenever it has been tried, let's say even in rich states like Chandigarh and Pondicherry in India, it somehow fails in implementation. I haven't studied it closely. I do not understand why it fails. I would understand if it failed in a deep rural areas because of all the transaction costs, etc. But even in areas like Pondicherry and Chandigarh, it hasn't worked out. That said, the efforts continue, and we'll see some movement in years to come. In energy sector, Junaid referred to it for farm power supply. What government is doing, there's no way that you can even, it's not even, doesn't even make sense to advise a chief minister to put a unit price on electricity, marginal cost on electricity. That's not going to happen. Everyone knows it should happen, but no one dares do it. So what they are doing is you're installing meters and telling farmers that if you consume less than, let's say, you used 2,000 units of power over the last 3 years on an annual basis. If you use less than that, then we pay you some money. So creating an opportunity cost, creating an incentive to be more judicious about it without charging anything off of you. Let's see if that works out. That will also require, like I said, state credibility. Farmers should trust the government and implementing it well.
You know, so there are examples of trying to counter a distortion with another distortion. And in economics, it's never clear that in a world of so many distortions, fixing one subsidy actually is welfare enhancing. But I think one of the most powerful stories in India is what has happened in education and health. In education and health, free services are given in public systems, and the poor have walked away from the public systems. You have poor people going and paying for school, paying for health, that they no longer want the free service. But it's not that the private schools and private health clinics are necessarily better in quality. We don't know. But what we do know is when you go to a private health clinic, they actually sit down and talk to you, as opposed to just keep you moving like a machine. I think ultimately, people making choices is going to force governments to change. Governments in the political economy don't change just for the welfare movement so easily. So for me, the distortions that are embedded themselves create the type of shifts which may undermine the distortions, but it takes time. And the opportunity cost of that is huge. Where do we want to be? When I first started working on water and sanitation in India, I presented two goals: 24/7 and no more open defecation. Those were the two goals, and this was year 2000. 24/7 was the best way I could capture the idea that intermittent water was costing the economy too much, both in terms of health and economic resources. So delivering continuous supply of water in cities was really the goal, 24/7. Stopping open defecation today, Swachh Bharat is a big story, goes without saying. But ultimately, what one is talking about is how do you ensure that natural resources are valued in a way that you use them to which reflect their value, right? Today we want to put a price on carbon because having not put a price on carbon, we have a lot of negative externalities, climate change and so on. So the goal of putting a price on carbon is to reverse the climate change. So in water, clearly water sustainability is the name of the game, but I think you have to translate it into what it means for people. So 24/7 is a very powerful concept that I never have to worry about spending money on a pump or on a storage or on a filter system in order to get money. I can open the tap and I'll get clean water 24/7. So one can develop these kind of goals. And once you start, and you're absolutely right, once you start putting these goals, you can then start working back to say, well, why don't we have 24/7? Well, that's the political economy story that I've tried to put on the table. Why is India different? It's a good question. India always says it's different. So that one I know for sure. As a Bangladeshi in India, I'm always told that India is different. African cities have 24/7 water. African cities price water. What is it that in India that prevents this from happening? I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but if I can venture a hypothesis, I think if I compare African countries, there the use of markets are far more powerful than the use of markets in India. And in particular, the philosophical relationship between the state and the markets are very different in Africa than in India. You know, I was telling Avinash and Roz earlier that when Chennai as a city faced scarcity, what Chennai city did was it would send out water tankers into the rural areas and buy water from the farmers and bring back the water to to the city. This was an informal market for water. While it was happening, and that's what kept water arriving in Chennai, no one tried to say, we can formalize this. It's okay, right? Somehow it was not okay to formalize it. Far better just leave it to be informal. Let's not talk about it. So for me, it's the whole concept of what role does a state play and what role would markets play, and what's the connection between them. India, from its beginning, central planning and beginning a federalism that's equalizing in its inception, I think created that philosophy that could explain some of these changes.
Can I also add, I think the question on the goal was from a nutritionist, and so I wanted to ask you, Avinash, about the food side. And when we think about the big subsidized crops of rice and wheat being big water guzzlers, and sugar is also kind of in there as a kind of water guzzler, what is the goal on the nutrition side? It's certainly not to have Indians eat just more rice, wheat, and sugar. Can you talk about your research or your?
So in 2013, India passed an act called National Food Security Act, and if you read the preamble of it, is to provide healthy quality food and nutrition. It has not just food but and nutrition for all. That's the policy. There is a large nutrition mission that is going on in India, where government is trying to bring all forms of hidden hunger, etc. So the goals are, it's hard to quarrel with the goals. The problem is the tools that we are taking to achieve our nutritional goals. Is on one hand, all nutritionists would tell you that diet diversity is essential for good nutrition. But if you keep subsidizing both production and consumption of starches, rice, wheat, and then sugarcane, then diet diversity is not going to happen, or would be slower. Actually, diets are diversifying in India, but it's much slower than what it would be if these policies were not there. There's a second policy also, which in the name of protecting farmers, we don't talk enough about it, is the trade policy. So in India, we want to only export. We don't want to import any agricultural produce. That also makes things more expensive than it is, and the production of it more resource depleting than it would otherwise be. So while we have ambitious nutritional goals, I think the policies that we have working towards it are not aligning with those goals and would make it that much harder. When it comes to the nutrition, actually food is one piece. There are India's own social, gender, economic issues there apart from food also that are also a big barrier. So Indians don't treat our women well. And you cannot achieve any of your nutritional goals if you don't treat your women well. If your moms, when they're pregnant, or even before they become pregnant, if they are malnourished, then kids will be malnourished, the first 1,000 days won't be good, and in the rest of life, a lot gets locked in. So some of it is food and water and wash, and they will help us achieve a lot. But unless we change as a society, I don't think even government can by fiat decide how we treat our women in the society. But in India, women are strongly discriminated against. That persists. It has not improved, or it has improved only marginally, unless that changes. So that's a whole different story apart from food, energy, water that is there. But even food, energy, water, where government can play the role, we are not playing it. And while I'm on the topic, let me recommend the book that Prabhu wrote on India's food system recently. I strongly recommend it. It covers all the different elements. It's a very good reference material. You can go on and add more to it if you want, but it covers a lot of these issues that we are talking about, including nutrition, urbanization, and other things. Last thing in nutrition, a parallel problem that is emerging very rapidly in India is that while we have undernutrition and high incidence of anemia and other things, overweight and obesity are also becoming quite common. So the most recent data shows that so Indians are unlucky. For us, the BMI threshold is 23, not 25. And if you use that cutoff, 1/3 of all Indian adults, 15 to 49 years age group, are overweight or obese. And it's rising very sharply. In just 10 years, that fraction has doubled. More in urban areas, more among women. And a lot of these women who are overweight, half of them are also anemic. So it's coincidence, syndemic, whatever you call it, and it's only getting worse. And it's very strongly correlated with, it's going to lead to a health disaster in India. It's already there. It's very, very strongly correlated with high blood pressure and blood sugar. So cheap sugar, of course, but this too. And what's happening, the whole food environment is not moving in the right direction. What's happening is, in the trade policy, one thing that we do in India is we have near free trade for palm oil. So edible oil consumption in India is rising very rapidly. So is snacking. So more Indian households buy snacks than they buy fruits. And it's showing up. Yeah, so that's a whole different subject.
Yeah. So on the nutrition, there has been a revolution in many parts of the world. The focus on the first 1,000 days is not something that was common in the development process. Today, we know that the first 1,000 days of a child is essential for the learning capacity, for the development of child lifetime. So intervention in that first 1,000 days has become very important. India has launched, and you mentioned that program with Anganwadi workers. It's just been extraordinary of how they've been able to really go into the low-income households and support nutrition interventions. The other, I think, revolution has been the self-help groups of women across South Asia and certainly in India, where you now have self-help groups of women that have come together, that are borrowing resources from banks. In fact, in the last decade, they borrowed about, I would say, about $30 billion and repaid them. I mean, it's astonishing that commercial banks' non-performing loans are 11%. Self-help groups' non-performing loans are 0.9%, right? So today, if you really want to put your money behind credit-worthy people, it's these self-help groups of women and not these corporates. These are the extraordinary stories of South Asia's community group collectives that have taken development in their hands. And it goes to your point that groundwater management ultimately will have to be driven by community groups, farmers groups, and so on, if it's to succeed.
So nutrition, just, I know it's off topic, but it is interesting in a way, the theory of change perspective. So in nutrition is one field where last 5-7 years you've seen the discourse had changed in India, and there's a lot of effort going on from the government side. Government is really trying hard to change some the nutritional status. My guess is that it's happened partly by researchers constantly banging on the racist in India, in the sense that constant comparison that India is doing worse than even sub-Saharan Africa is what just shamed government into action. And I'm not saying, or even worse than Bangladesh and other countries that we like to upon, sorry, Junaid, government was deeply embarrassed, and IFPRI's own global hunger index, which now has been discontinued from IFPRI's side, showing India's rank being like really, really low, has been one of, I don't think that's the only thing, but just somehow Indian government is quite into ranks and indices of comparison. I don't know if there can be a parallel thing for natural resources, but that helped.
Yeah,
in getting government to work.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. I'll take one or two more. So let me get here and here just to diversify. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adit, and I'm a Knight Hennessy scholar here. And both of you have been talking quite a bit about how a lot of these sectors are connected: energy, water, food, nutrition, agriculture, all these are connected. So if you were to pick one particular sector and one particular policy where you would want to affect an initial change that will reverberate to the other sectors and have the maximum impact, what would that sector and policy be, and why?
Okay, that's great. We'll take one more question on the table. And
my name's Nathan. I'm a water analyst with Creative Harmonic Solutions, where we run analysis charts for all various forms of toxicity. And my question happens to be with regards to collecting rainwater. We've seen in for farmers in Oregon as well as Northern California. They're trying to establish laws to restrict farmers from collecting rainwater.
Okay.
It's restricting.
Restricting fully, and where counties are moving in and trying to charge and either arrest farmers or charge them astronomical fees for collecting rainwater.
Okay, this is interesting. Okay, so we have the two questions, and then we will, just so you know, have time for more. We'll bring the speakers into the other room, and you can ask over drinks. So, first question was, can you give any sector, you know, a change that can be transformational in terms of spilling over into other sectors? And then this question of altering this hydrologic cycle through rainwater capture.
Well, actually, this question that you ask, what sector? So I think I tried to imply in what I shared with you that for me, the real story is the structure of government. And I feel that the future of India will lie in strengthening its local governments. If India can push its federalism, and in pushing its federalism, strengthen the third tier, it will change the discourse of the relationship between the citizen and the state. And when the discourse between the citizen and the state changes, you'll see an incredibly different development process emerging. So if there was one thing that I'd like to see implemented, would be the implementation of the 73rd and 74th Amendment in India, i.e. local governments in India. I think that would transform India in so many different ways, with implications for energy, nutrition, education, and so on. On rainwater, India is very big on rainwater harvesting. In fact, it's seen as a solution to a lot of the problems, whereas I think the answer is, when you have all these distortions, rainwater harvesting is not going to resolve all the distortions in the way water is managed. So I'm quite surprised by the example you've given,
in India too, water engineers, if they had their way, they would have similar policy like you have in Oregon, because they don't like it. Especially the rainwater harvesting is more popular in areas where you have more land, because you need more land and more rains. So Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, these hard rock areas, those are the areas where you have had dams. And in river basin things, these river basins are over appropriated, meaning the capacity, the reservoir capacities that we have created through medium and large dams is more than 70% dependability what would flow into them, like fill. So anytime you are doing rainwater harvesting in your field or in your village, you are reducing the flow to these reservoirs from which water will go through canals. So engineers, the hydrologists, the large planners, they don't like it. But they started almost as religious and quasi-religious movements in many parts of India, or third sector movement, and became so popular that governments came back and started supporting it. So in Gujarat, for example, which has every kind of water problem you can imagine in one state, it started by the diamond merchants and a quasi-religious group supporting it, became very popular, and then the government wanted to cash in on this popularity and brought in subsidies, etc. So in India, you cannot ban it. That said, the big water planners, the dam managers do not like it, and if they had their way, they would also ban it. On the which sector I would pick, I mean, it's hard to disagree with what Junaid said. That, of course, lies at the core of everything, the governance capacity, especially at the local level. But if I had to pick in a shorter term which one it would be, I think I would pick energy, partly because it is linked to many others. And since what happens with energy supply and energy policy for agriculture also affects industry and households, etc., it's easier to build a constituency. All said and done, there are more non-farmers than farmers in India. So it's easier to build a constituency of reform, especially when power supply to farmers. For example, farmers get only 8 hours of power supply. That affects the rest of the household, etc., in the village who are non-farming households, etc., too. So if you want to change that, then you go and get those groups on your side in a political thing. So there, I think, because every day you're bleeding money, and there are others also who are getting affected, the industry, the household, and others. So it's easier, probably, not easy, but easier, to build that constituency and have multiple effects. So I would, if I had to pick of the options that you listed, energy. But yes, governance reforms is, of course, at the core of everything. Thank you.
Ross, I think one important caveat I want to make in what I've shared, India has had an extraordinary story of lifting people out of poverty. And it's driven by its growth. Right? Economic growth and poverty reduction have been extraordinary in India. What I think we're seeing in India's growth path is that the growth path has not lifted the access to services at the same level as its growth in per capita income. So in many ways, this aspiration to become middle income is not leading to middle income service delivery. That's the real takeaway, using water as an example. And the second story is that its growth path has not been respectful of natural resource management. In fact, South Asia as a whole, it's incredible. We've done some looking at the data. It is the most damaging of natural resources. The growth path is most damaging of natural resources than any other region or in the history of economic growth. That's really the issue. So I wouldn't want anyone leaving this room to think that India is not transforming itself. It is, but its transformation has to take into account several other things, because if it doesn't, it's not going to be able to sustain that growth. I think that's something I wanted to impress on everyone.
That's a great note to end on. And we do have a reception in the back, so please enjoy and share your thoughts with the authors. But I want to thank both Junaid and Ahmad. You guys.